The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson as Penelope Thompson sat alone at the corner of Willow Creek's modest market square, her slender fingers trembling as she arranged the last of her handcrafted baskets. At 26, the weight of widowhood had already carved delicate lines around her eyes, though the emerald depth still held a glimmer of the spirited woman she had been before typhoid had claimed her husband just 8 months prior. The year was 1878, and the small Colorado town was experiencing a revival of sorts. The railroad had finally extended its reach to their corner of the territory, bringing with it new opportunities and faces. Penelope, however, found little comfort in the promise of progress. The small ranch she had shared with Thomas was slipping through her fingers, the mortgage payments becoming increasingly impossible to meet on basket sales alone. As the market began to empty, merchants packing away their unsold goods, Penelope fought back the tears that threatened to spill. Not a single basket sold today. The weight of failure pressed down on her shoulders as she contemplated returning to her cold, empty home with nothing to show for a day's effort but sore fingers and a hungry stomach. "Those are mighty fine baskets, madam." The deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Penelope looked up to find herself staring into the most striking pair of blue eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and a jawline shadowed by a day's growth of beard. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, the leather vest and denim pants marking him as one of the many cowboys passing through. "Thank you, sir," she replied softly, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of horses and wagons. "They're not much, but they're sturdy." The stranger's gaze swept over her small display, then back to her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "How much for the lot?" Penelope blinked in confusion. All of them," he nodded, removing his hat to reveal dark hair with an unruly curl falling across his forehead. "Name's Isaac Blackburn, just signed on as foreman at the Carson Ranch outside of town." He extended a calloused hand. "And I reckon I'm in need of some baskets." "Penelope Thompson," she responded, hesitantly placing her smaller hand in his. "But nobody needs this many baskets, Mr. Blackburn." A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Maybe I'm planning on doing a lot of picnicking." When she didn't return his smile, his expression softened. "Truth is, madam, I recognize quality when I see it. My mother used to weave baskets back in Missouri. These would fetch triple what you're asking in Denver." Before she could protest further, he reached into his pocket and pulled out more money than she'd seen in months, placing it on the table between them. "I'll take them all, and I'll be needing more when you have them ready." Penelope stared at the money, her mind spinning with possibilities. It would cover the mortgage payment with enough left over for supplies and food. "Mr. Blackburn, I can't possibly—" "Isaac," he corrected gently. "And you can, I insist." As he gathered the baskets, stacking them carefully in his arms, Penelope felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest, a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps today wasn't the end of everything after all. What Penelope couldn't have known as she watched Isaac Blackburn walk away with her baskets was that he'd just purchased far more than hand-woven containers. He'd bought her a chance at a future one that would soon become inextricably entwined with his own. The following morning, Penelope woke before dawn, her fingers already itching to begin weaving. For the first time since Thomas's passing, she felt purpose driving her movements as she collected the willow branches she had soaking in the creek behind her small cabin. The money from Isaac Blackburn's purchase had lifted an immediate weight, but she wasn't foolish enough to believe one lucky sale would solve all her problems. By mid-morning, she had the beginnings of 3 new baskets taking shape. The repetitive motion of weaving had always brought her comfort, a meditation of sorts that allowed her mind to wander. Today, it wandered repeatedly to the striking cowboy with kind eyes. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Visitors were rare this far from town. She quickly smoothed her apron and tucked a stray lock of auburn hair behind her ear before opening the door. Isaac Blackburn stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking far more put together than he had at the market. His dark hair was neatly combed and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline that matched the breadth of his shoulders. "Mr. Blackburn," she stammered, suddenly conscious of her simple dress and work-roughened hands. "Isaac," he reminded her with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, though she remained blocking the doorway. Propriety dictated she shouldn't invite a man into her home without a chaperone. "What brings you all the way out here?" He cleared his throat. "I spoke with Mr. Grayson at the general store about your baskets. He mentioned you might be willing to teach the craft. The Carson Ranch is starting to host visitors from back east, folks wanting a taste of Western life. I thought offering basket weaving lessons might be something our guests would enjoy." Penelope's brow furrowed. "You rode all this way to ask if I would teach wealthy Easterners how to weave baskets." A flush crept up Isaac's neck. "When you put it that way, it does sound rather foolish." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Truth is, Mrs. Thompson, I know what it's like to be on the edge of losing everything. After the war, I nearly lost my family's farm before I headed west. I thought this might be a way to help that wouldn't wound your pride." His candor caught her off guard. Most men she knew would have offered charity outright or worse, suggested she remarry quickly. This subtle offer of employment showed a level of understanding and respect she hadn't expected. "I appreciate the thought, Mr. Blackburn Isaac," she corrected herself. "But I'm not sure I'm cut out for teaching." "Would you at least consider it?" he asked. "The pay would be fair and it would only be a few days each month." Penelope hesitated. "The additional income would certainly help, and it would give her something beyond survival to focus on." "I'll think on it," she finally agreed, his face brightened. "That's all I ask." He glanced past her to the half-completed baskets on her table. "Those are coming along nicely. When you finish, I'd be happy to deliver them to Denver for you. I make the trip monthly for ranch business." The offer was tempting. Denver merchants would indeed pay better prices, but she'd never been able to make the journey alone. "That's very kind of you." Isaac replaced his hat, the movement practiced and fluid. "Not kindness, Mrs. Thompson, good business sense." He stepped back from the porch. "I'll come by next week to hear your decision about the teaching." She nodded, watching as he mounted his horse with the grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. As he rode away, Penelope remained in the doorway longer than necessary, her eyes following his retreating figure until he disappeared over the ridge. For the first time in 8 months, she felt something other than grief and worry. It was a dangerous feeling, one she quickly tamped down. Isaac Blackburn was simply a kind man offering business opportunities. Nothing more. Yet as she returned to her weaving, she found herself taking extra care with each strand, imagining blue eyes appraising her work with approval. The next market day arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Penelope had spent every waking hour completing 5 new baskets, each more intricate than the last. She'd used techniques her grandmother had taught her, incorporating patterns rarely seen in the simple utilitarian baskets most folks used. She set up her modest display with more care than usual, arranging the baskets to showcase their unique designs. The market was busier today, the recent train arrival bringing new faces to town. Penelope watched as people passed her table, some pausing to admire her work, but moving on without purchasing. By midday, she had sold one small basket to a kindly older woman who had haggled the price down to less than Penelope had hoped. She was beginning to wonder if Isaac's confidence in her craftsmanship had been misplaced when a shadow fell across her table. "Mrs. Thompson," came a familiar voice. She looked up to find Isaac standing there, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood an elegant woman in a traveling suit that screamed of Eastern wealth and sophistication. "Isaac," she acknowledged with a nod, then offered a polite smile to his companion. "Good afternoon. This is Mrs. Eleanor Carson," Isaac introduced. "She owns the Carson Ranch where I work." "Mrs. Carson, this is Penelope Thompson, the basket weaver I mentioned." The older woman's shrewd eyes assessed Penelope with interest. "Mr. Blackburn speaks very highly of your work," she said, her accent unmistakably Boston. "I see he wasn't exaggerating." She picked up one of the baskets, examining the tight weave and decorative pattern. "Exceptional craftsmanship." "Thank you," Penelope replied, caught off guard by the woman's directness. Mrs. Carson turned to Isaac. "You were right. These would be perfect for the Harvest Festival gift baskets." She looked back at Penelope. "Young woman, I would like to commission 20 baskets to be filled with Colorado specialties as gifts for our Eastern investors. Can you manage that by September? 20 baskets." Penelope's mind raced with calculations. "It would be tight but possible, and the income would be substantial." "Yes, madam, I believe I can." "Excellent. Mr. Blackburn will work out the details with you." Mrs. Carson's gaze softened slightly. "He also mentioned you might be willing to teach some of our guests the basics of your craft." "I think it would add a charming touch to their experience." Penelope glanced at Isaac, who was watching her with quiet encouragement in his eyes. Something in his expression gave her courage. "I would be happy to try, Mrs. Carson." "Wonderful." The woman handed the basket to Isaac. "Purchase this one for me, would you? I'll take it as a sample to show the others." With a nod to Penelope, she swept away into the crowd, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume. Isaac placed money on the table, twice what Penelope had been asking for the basket. Before she could protest, he said, "Mrs. Carson expects quality to be properly compensated. She'll pay the same for each of the 20. Penelope's eyes widened. The amount would cover her mortgage for several months. "That's too much," she whispered. "It's exactly right," Isaac countered. He hesitated, then added, "I was hoping I might call on you tomorrow to discuss the details of the commission. Perhaps I could bring lunch." The invitation hung between them, weighted with implications beyond business. Penelope should refuse, she knew that. Proper widows didn't entertain gentlemen callers so soon after their husband's passing. But there was something in Isaac's direct gaze that made propriety seem less important than it once had. "I would like that," she said softly. A smile broke across his face, transforming his rugged features into something boyishly charming. "1 o'clock then," she nodded, and he tipped his hat before turning to follow Mrs. Carson. Penelope watched him go, aware of curious glances from nearby vendors. She knew there would be talk, there always was in small towns, but for once, she found she didn't care. The prospect of tomorrow's lunch filled her with a nervous anticipation she hadn't felt in years. It was just business, she reminded herself. But as she packed up her remaining baskets at day's end, she couldn't help but wonder if the flutter in her chest meant something more was beginning to weave itself into the empty spaces of her life. The next day, Penelope woke with the sun, her usual routine suddenly insufficient. She scrubbed the cabin until it shone, baked fresh bread, and even picked wildflowers for the table actions that seemed foolish for a simple business lunch. But as the clock ticked toward 1, she changed into her second-best dress and pinned her hair more carefully than usual. Isaac arrived precisely at 1, his arms laden with a basket that wasn't one of her making. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted her, removing his hat as she opened the door. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of bringing a proper picnic. It's too fine a day to be indoors." The thoughtfulness of his gesture touched her. "That sounds lovely," she replied, reaching for her shawl. They settled beneath an old oak tree near the creek that bordered her property. Isaac spread a blanket and unpacked an impressive array of food: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and even a jar of preserves. "This is quite a feast," Penelope remarked, accepting the plate he offered. "Cook at the ranch packed it," Isaac admitted with a grin. "I'm afraid my own culinary skills are limited to coffee and beans." The confession made her laugh, a sound so foreign to her own ears that it startled her. How long had it been since she'd laughed? Since Thomas fell ill, certainly. They ate in comfortable conversation, with Isaac explaining Mrs. Carson's vision for the Harvest Festival and Penelope sharing ideas for basket designs. But as the business discussion concluded, neither made a move to end their time together. "How did you come to be at the Carson Ranch?" Penelope asked, genuinely curious about the man sitting across from her. Isaac leaned back against the tree trunk, his face thoughtful. "I was Army cavalry for years after the war. Spent time chasing outlaws and escorting stagecoaches until a bullet found my shoulder 2 years ago." He touched his left shoulder briefly. "Decided I'd had enough of that life. Mrs. Carson's husband hired me based on my experience with horses. When he passed last year, she kept me on as foreman." "I'm sorry about your injury," Penelope said softly. He shrugged. "It was a blessing in disguise. Forced me to find a more peaceful way to live." His eyes found hers. "What about you, Mrs. Thompson? Have you always lived in Colorado?" "Penelope," she corrected, feeling bold. "And no. I came west as a bride 6 years ago. Thomas had dreams of building a cattle empire." She gestured to the modest cabin and small corral. This was to be just the beginning. "He sounds like a man with vision." "He was," she agreed, surprised that speaking of Thomas didn't bring the usual sharp pain, but he was more dreamer than businessman. "When he died, I discovered we were deeper in debt than I'd realized." Isaac's expression grew serious. "Is that why you were at the market that day?" "The debt," Penelope nodded, her honesty surprising even herself. "The bank has been patient, but patience has limits. Your purchase bought me time." "I'm glad," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "You know, Mrs. Carson is looking for a new housekeeper. The position comes with room and board at the main house. If you're interested—" "No," Penelope interrupted, more sharply than she intended. Seeing his startled expression, she softened her tone. "Forgive me, but this land, this home, it's all I have left of the life Thomas and I built. I can't abandon it." Isaac studied her face, something like admiration in his eyes. "I understand. Some things are worth fighting for." The words hung between them as the afternoon light filtered through the leaves above, dappling the blanket with patterns of sun and shadow. In that moment, Penelope realized she was seeing Isaac Blackburn not as a customer or benefactor, but as a man, one whose strength and kindness were becoming dangerously appealing. As if sensing her thoughts, Isaac began gathering their picnic things. "I should be getting back to the ranch," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "But I'll return in a week to check on the baskets for Mrs. Carson." Penelope helped him pack, their hands occasionally brushing, each touch sending an unexpected warmth through her fingers. When everything was back in the basket, they walked together to where his horse waited. "Thank you for the lunch," she said, suddenly shy. Isaac mounted his horse with fluid grace, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The pleasure was mine, Penelope," he said, using her given name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice made her heart skip. As he rode away, Penelope hugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the warm day. Something was shifting inside her, something both frightening and exhilarating. The widow who had sat alone at the market was beginning to feel like a different woman entirely. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that brought new purpose to Penelope's days. She rose with the sun to work on Mrs. Carson's basket commission, her fingers flying over the willow strands with renewed energy. Twice a week, she rode into town to teach basket weaving to Eastern visitors at the Carson Ranch, finding unexpected joy in sharing her grandmother's traditions. And every Sunday after church, Isaac would appear at her cabin, sometimes with lunch, sometimes with supplies for her work, but always with stories that made her laugh and thoughtful questions that made her feel truly seen for the first time in years. They were careful to maintain propriety, always meeting outdoors or with her door left conspicuously open. But as June turned to July, Penelope couldn't deny that her feelings for the quiet cowboy had grown into something that both terrified and thrilled her. "You're different lately," Martha Evans, the shopkeeper's wife, remarked one afternoon as Penelope selected materials at the general store. "There's color in your cheeks again." Penelope busied herself examining a spool of decorative twine. "It's just the summer sun," she deflected. Martha's knowing smile said she wasn't fooled. "Isaac Blackburn is a good man," she said quietly. "Thomas would want you to be happy, you know." The words followed Penelope home, echoing in her mind as she worked late into the evening on her baskets. Would Thomas want her to find happiness again? They had been fond of each other, their marriage more partnership than passion, but he had been kind and had genuinely cared for her welfare. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats unusual at this hour. She set aside her work and moved to the window, relief flooding through her when she recognized Isaac's silhouette in the moonlight. Relief quickly turned to concern when she noticed the urgency in his posture. She opened the door before he could knock. "Isaac, what's wrong?" He dismounted quickly, his expression grim. "Penelope, I need to speak with you. May I come in?" The seriousness in his voice alarmed her. "Of course." Once inside, Isaac removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I've just come from town. There's talk that the bank is calling in loans across the county. Times are getting hard with the silver mines closing." Penelope sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "My mortgage?" Isaac nodded. "I spoke with the bank manager. Your loan is among those being reviewed. They're giving folks 30 days to pay in full or vacate." 30 days! The room seemed to spin. Even with Mrs. Carson's commission, she couldn't possibly raise enough money in a month. "But the harvest festival isn't until September. I won't be paid until then." Isaac knelt beside her chair, his blue eyes intense in the lamplight. "I have savings," he said quietly, "enough to cover your loan." Penelope stared at him in shock. "Isaac, no, I couldn't possibly accept. It would be a business arrangement," he interrupted. "An investment in your basket enterprise. We could draw up papers, make it official." The offer was tempting, so tempting, but Penelope had learned the hard way what happened when pride overcame practicality. Thomas had refused help too many times, insisting he could manage alone. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. Isaac's gaze dropped to his hat, still clutched in his hands. "Because I can't bear the thought of you losing your home." He looked up, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. "Because in these past months you've become important to me, Penelope. More important than I have any right to claim." The confession hung in the air between them, changing everything. Penelope felt tears welling in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she wasn't alone anymore. "I don't know what to say," she managed. Isaac rose, moving back a respectful distance. "You don't need to say anything tonight. Think about my offer, the business offer," he clarified hastily. "As for the rest, well, that's for you to consider in your own time if you're so inclined." He placed his hat back on his head, the gesture signaling his departure. "I'll come back tomorrow. We can talk more then." Penelope walked him to the door, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. At the threshold, Isaac paused, looking down at her with such tenderness that it nearly undid her composure. "Whatever you decide about the loan," he said softly, "know that meeting you that day at the market was the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Penelope standing in her doorway with her heart pounding and her future hanging in the balance. Sleep eluded Penelope that night as she weighed Isaac's offer against her pride. By dawn, she had made her decision. She wouldn't accept his money outright, but she wouldn't let stubborn pride cost her everything either. There had to be a middle path. She was on her third cup of coffee when a knock came at her door. Expecting Isaac, she was surprised to find Mrs. Carson on her porch instead, looking decidedly out of place in her fine clothes. "Mrs. Thompson," the older woman greeted her. "May I come in? I believe we have matters to discuss." Puzzled, Penelope invited her inside, hastily clearing space at the table among her basket-making supplies. Mrs. Carson settled herself with the poise of a queen, surveying the cabin with shrewd eyes. "Mr. Blackburn came to see me very early this morning," she began without preamble. "He was quite distraught about your situation with the bank." Penelope's cheeks burned with embarrassment. I apologize if he disturbed you, Mrs. Carson. My financial difficulties are my own to resolve. Are they? The older woman raised an elegant eyebrow. Young woman, do you know why I hired Isaac Blackburn when every ranch in the territory wanted him? The question caught Penelope off guard. I assumed because of his experience. Partly, Mrs. Carson acknowledged, but primarily because he sees possibilities where others see problems. When my husband died, everyone said a widow couldn't run a ranch. Isaac not only believed I could but showed me how. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. He sees the same potential in you. Penelope didn't know how to respond to that. Mrs. Carson continued, her tone businesslike once more. I have a proposal. The Carson Ranch is expanding our enterprises to include local crafts for our Eastern visitors. We need someone to oversee production and quality, someone who understands traditional techniques. She fixed Penelope with a direct stare. The position includes a salary sufficient to cover your mortgage payments, with profits to be shared once sales begin. Penelope's mind raced. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a partnership, Mrs. Carson corrected. You would retain your independence and this property, but with the security of regular income. It was almost too good to believe. And Isaac suggested this? A knowing smile touched the older woman's lips. He suggested I might find your skills valuable to the ranch. The particulars are my own doing. She rose, smoothing her skirts. Think about it, Mrs. Thompson. The offer stands regardless of any other arrangements you might make with Mr. Blackburn. With that cryptic statement, she departed, leaving Penelope standing in her doorway for the second time in 24 hours, wondering how her life had changed so dramatically since that fateful market day. She was still contemplating Mrs. Carson's offer when Isaac arrived an hour later, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. Mrs. Carson was here, Penelope said by way of greeting. Isaac removed his hat, looking slightly chagrined. I hope you're not upset that I spoke to her. I was trying to think of solutions that might preserve your independence. The thoughtfulness behind his actions touched her deeply. She offered me a partnership, Penelope said, watching his reaction carefully. Relief flooded his features. And will you accept? Penelope stepped aside, inviting him in. I believe I will. It seems to be a fair arrangement that benefits us both. She closed the door behind him, an intimacy they had never before allowed, which means I won't need to borrow money from you after all. Was that disappointment that flashed across his face? That's good news, he said, his voice not quite matching his words. Penelope moved closer to him, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. However, there is something else I would like from you, Isaac Blackburn. His eyes darkened with an emotion that sent heat coursing through her. What might that be, Penelope Thompson? The truth, she said simply. About why you really bought my baskets that day at the market. Isaac's gaze held hers steadily. Because you looked like a woman who needed someone to believe in her as much as she believed in herself. He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. And because from the moment I saw you sitting there, so proud even in your worry, I couldn't look away. The honesty of his answer broke something open inside her, a door she had locked tight after Thomas died. I've been so afraid, she whispered. Afraid of losing everything, afraid of being alone, and most of all, afraid of feeling again. And now, his voice was rough with emotion. Penelope reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Now I'm only afraid of never knowing what might have been if I hadn't been sitting alone at that market when a certain cowboy decided to buy more baskets than any man could possibly need. Isaac's laugh was soft and warm as he caught her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm. Best purchase I ever made. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of possibilities rather than a demand. When they parted, Penelope saw in Isaac's eyes the future he had purchased along with her baskets. Not just survival, but a chance at happiness neither of them had expected to find. 6 months later, Penelope stood in the center of her new workshop, built adjacent to the cabin with lumber and labor provided by the Carson Ranch. The autumn light streamed through large windows, illuminating shelves lined with completed baskets and tables where 3 local women worked alongside her, learning the craft to meet the growing demand from Eastern merchants. Her partnership with Mrs. Carson had flourished beyond anyone's expectations, with orders now coming from as far away as New York and Boston. The mortgage was paid, the cabin expanded, and for the first time in years, Penelope faced winter without fear of what the cold months might bring. But the greatest change wasn't in her financial circumstances or her business success. It was in the gold band that now adorned her left hand, matching the one worn by the man who entered the workshop carrying a tray of coffee for the workers. "Ladies," Isaac greeted them with a tip of his hat, eliciting smiles and nods as he distributed the cups. Coming to Penelope last, he set the tray aside and slipped an arm around her waist. "How's my wife this afternoon?" The word still sent a thrill through her, even 2 months after their wedding. "Busy," she replied, leaning into his embrace, "but happy." He pressed a kiss to her temple, no longer concerned with the propriety that had once governed their interactions. Mrs. Carson asked if we'd join her for dinner tonight. "Apparently, there's a banker from Denver she wants you to meet someone interested in financing a larger workshop in town." Penelope turned in his arms to face him. "What do you think? Are we ready for that?" Isaac's eyes, as blue and steady as the day they first met, held nothing but confidence. "I think you're ready for anything, Penelope Blackburn. You always were, you just needed someone to remind you." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the workshop floor, Penelope rested her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. From widow sitting alone at a market to respected businesswoman and beloved wife, the journey still sometimes felt like a dream. But the strength of Isaac's arms around her was real, as was the love that had grown between them since that fateful day when a kind-hearted cowboy had seen something worth investing in when he looked at her baskets and at her. What he had purchased that day wasn't just her craft or even her future. He had bought them both a second chance at happiness, weaving their lives together as intricately and beautifully as the baskets that had first brought them together. And as Isaac leaned down to capture her lips in a kiss that still made her knees weak, Penelope knew that some investments yielded returns far more precious than gold. They yielded love, belonging, and a future brighter than either of them could have imagined alone.